Chris Sampson. Chris Sampson is a photojournalist and editor-in-chief of National Security Media based in Ukraine. He documents the war's impact and the resilience of Ukrainians, telling their stories for a global audience. His work is available at samsonshots.com and on Instagram. And what I'll do is I'll put that link inside of the in chat as well. You can find his work at samsonshots.com. Look, he also is starting his Substack. Please, folks, those of you here in Substack, remember, just go ahead and click on his Nats. I'm going to put the link to his Substack in the chat as well. I should have had that ready. I don't, but I will in a second to put his Substack link in the chat so that you can go ahead and get to his Substack link. There is the link to his Substack. I just put that into the chat as well. Okay, folks, we're going to get started with Chris. He reports on Russian military operations, occupied territories, and propaganda campaigns, and advocates for the release of captive civilians. Before Ukraine, he served as a chief of research in terrorism studies, tracking ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and extremist networks worldwide. Sampson has co-authored Hacking ISIS, contributed to Senate reports on Russian influence, and served as lead researcher for multiple New York Times bestsellers. He has appeared on MSNBC, BBC, CTV, Cheddar TV, GCTV, and Kyiv Post, and been cited in the Washington Post, Newsweek, and the Daily Beast. He began his journalism career in radio at KPFT 90.1 FM. You who listen to this show know that is our genesis as well. And the Spanish language news program, Nieto. Outside reporting, Sampson studies and performs global music. He's a guitarist. He beats the drum. You name it. Our brother here is into it, specializing in Indian classical percussion and frame drums. Again, I put the link in there where you can follow him. But anyway, welcome aboard, Chris Sampson and my fellow former colleague at KPFT. Well, you know what? I will never call an independent journalist and fellow colleague at KPFT other than a permanent colleague, because KPFT in our blood and we stay there. Welcome aboard, my brother. Talk to me.
Hey, thanks. First off, thank you. And it was important to talk to you because, like we talked to our mutual friend, Brad Rich, that's my original family when it came to everything. My active or radio. KPFT was the station we would listen to. When I was entering college, I heard music that wasn't normal pop music, and it was KPFT. When it was Indian music playing, as I was recording on KPFT. And then in the 90s, I joined in the studio a couple of times and had a show. And then wound up on Night Sounds as a guest, and then using me on board as a host. Started doing anything at the station necessary to help our cause, which was any number of things. But I had technical skills. So between me and my master guru that he is, Otis McClay, we did live streams. We did everything. We invented things that didn't exist for how radio could work on no budget. And that leads to me a lot of the skills that I walked into with here. In fact, in my phone, and I keep with me, is a letter of recommendation from our great station manager, Dwayne Bradley, who put me in tears with his endorsement, because what he said was, of all the people I've known, there are very few people who could do this because I've seen him do it before. KPFT had its news service gutted in the 90s. I don't know when it was finally done, but under the previous regime, before 2000, the news service that had existed was gutted and a new one had to be built. And it was from scrappy volunteers who had attitude. But we had a fantastic editor, Renee Feltz. And Renee has had a significant impact on my work because she was brutal with the editor pen in a way that was a teaching moment every time you walked in with copy. And it made you better. It may not have been comfortable, but it made you better. And then working with volunteers was a big skill that you had to learn around KP as a producer. And that's what helps here, is working with people who are going through things that are very complicated, but taking and converting their energy from frustration into action. So in the case of people who are not subject of a story, I have friends who get sort of paralysis in where they were because of the war. And I go, well, would you like to do journalism or something like that? Sure. Next thing you know, they're helping me produce a video clip, or a series of interviews or stories, and put them into action instead of frustration. And I learned that at KPFT Pacifica, frankly. And I'll also say in the different community parts that relate to how Pacifica in Houston, through KPFT, how KPFT operated within those communities, really gave me the basis on everything I get done right around here. Done incorrectly is my fault.
No, well, look, you know what? I tell you what, it's great that we have you now in Kyiv, Ukraine. I want to give
on Independence Day.
Tell us a little bit about that.
34th. Yeah.
Tell folks about Ukraine's independence. How long have it been in existence in this iteration?
Well, I think it's important to hear it as a second iteration because Ukraine existed briefly from 1917 until 1921 when the Russian monarchy fell apart and when the Bolsheviks were seizing through. And there had already been an ambition to have a national identity in place. And it was stomped out through basically the Bolshevism. And, it's tragic because I've done a lot of study of that era, especially living in country where I can talk to people and get a range of experiences. So there are some people who have, one set of historical views and others that have additional views in a different region. And you can really get into some nuances being here at really matter when it comes to identity. They get lost in the West. And I think that the reason why people don't understand this particular conflict, and I want to say not the war, because the war is the war, but I mean the conflict that exists between saying, well, aren't they brothers? Aren't they cousins? Aren't these? Well, no. In some cases, yes. There are people who are literally biologically related across that border. And we've had stories I've recorded on Facebook blocks, things that seem surreal in the 21st century. Like, I don't talk to my sister anymore because something. But as far as the people are concerned and the language, etc., Ukraine has its distinct identity, and it tried to establish it in 1917 and fought for that. And so through that era after 1921 into 1991, there were so many different ways that Ukrainians were treated that I think that when I talk to people like, for instance, guys I know who served in the Soviet army who are older Ukrainians, they get called racist terms in their service by Russians. They're the way minorities get called that in the U.S. military, for example. There's a not just subhuman, but second class human. And in some cases, when it's done really evil, it's subhuman, and that just gets old. It gets old. Let me
interrupt and ask a question, because you started at 1917, but let's go before 1917. Is there a distinct Ukrainian population and a distinct Russian population?
Well, yes. And so when you say distinct, I'd have to think about what you mean distinct. Because
let's give an example. I'll give you a good example. With colonialism,
there were distinctions, yes.
Right, but in colonialism in Africa, these borders are all false. We have Niger, right. or all these borders. They didn't take into account tribes that set it up, people that had their unions. When it comes to, let's say, that part of Europe, Russia and Ukraine, just like you had distinct tribes in, let's say, Africa and other places that were forced together, is that the same thing that we find in Ukraine, where false borders are actually what we have?
Sort of, yes. There is significant, the map would look radically different if you could remove the way Russians moved people around. So the way they placed the people in Crimea, for instance, the indigenous Tatar people, then if you could wipe out the way Stalin moved people around, yeah, you can see things, but you can't when they're constantly moved around, and it's doing it now. They're literally doing it in the 21st century.
So that's
part of why you can't see what in the USSR did versus throughout imperialist Russia. So if you go further back, one argument or one premise about Ukrainian identity is that where I live dates back well over 1,000 years of cogent history, including, yes, the Golden Horde, the Vikings first and then Golden Horde, and then onward. But it's the fact that the location can't move, right? I'm literally in Kyiv. No matter what you do, this is Kyiv, right? What is ultimately centered here? It's not Russian. This is not Russian. Period. It's just not Russian. All the way to Lviv, not Russian. Now, the question starts being, well, how Russian does it start getting to the east? This is where people start trying to fog it. The truth is Kharkiv, and actually even further out, there are areas in now what is Russian territory that have been Ukrainian identity when the real Russian identity was mostly locked in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Okay. So when real Russian identity is so locked into Moscow and St. Petersburg more than anything, then you start seeing where things really lie. Not these things in between. So the things in between will have some fusion, yes. But Russia wants to say if it's Russian language oriented, it's theirs. Well, the problem is that they subdued the other languages. You were not allowed to speak the other languages. You couldn't assert the other languages, the other cultural overtones at all. You could be a farmer, but you couldn't be a Ukrainian farmer in any imagery. The Ukrainian side was wiped out unless they could make it folkloric. Then that was allowable. And this is where it creates what we call the Malorussia concept. So Russia is the big one and Malorussia is like little Russia. Well, but that's, from colonialism, how many people have an identity thrown on them that is not their freaking identity. It is not their identity. They know it and they'll play along. I have friends from South Africa named Richard and Benji. I never call them by their Christian names. It's Moremi and Pendazella. Because those names were the names that their parents gave them, not the ones that they adopted when they went to school. When they went to school, they had to conform with the white man's rules in apartheid. Similarly here, Taras Shevchenko, the poet that is at the root of Ukrainian identity, well, you'll find a statue of him in Russian-controlled area, absent the Ukrainian side, but promoting the worker side, And this is what Russians did to Ukrainians. Ukrainians knew this, and so by 1991, the referendum came around and say, we're done. They were done. And they knew back then that Russia would do what they're doing now, by the way. They warned about it. We didn't listen.
But they went ahead under the auspices of the United States, who promised them security. They went ahead and gave up their nukes, right? Yeah.
So a couple of years later, right, in the Budapest memorandum era, UK, United States, and Russia said, if you cede your nuclear arsenal, then we will promise that you have security guarantees. And there were no there was nothing in it. It was nothing. It was big nothingness.
Yeah. So, let me pause for a second here and tell the audience that Chris is willing to answer any questions. What we try to do is kind of give an overview of the Ukraine and as from a nationalist point of view. And he's willing to take questions if anybody wants to ask something, or if you put it in the chat as well. Either way, 281-823-7747. And I'll repost that into the chat. It is go ahead.
Yeah. One of the things I told you, this is for our viewers or listeners, is that, as someone who does news work and also who is an American concerned about where our support is, I want to hear what people have to ask, and especially if they have questions about things that are confusing in the news, things about, you mentioned before in our phone call about the negotiations or these big high-end meetings and such. And I hear a lot about what the MAGA side feels, but I don't get enough of what the side that I know I came from KPFT feels. And I hear different people who have, different views from supporting to against. And I thought, well, let's go have a dialogue with people I'm closest to historically and see where they're at.
While we wait for folks who may either ask in the chat or decide to call, tell us a little bit about the state of the war right now as you're experiencing it in Kyiv and elsewhere, because I know that you drive a lot outside of Kyiv to many of this, more than the surrounding areas, but sometimes you go deep into territory.
Okay, so the hottest part of the war right now is in two areas. I'll start with that part and come back to the city. Is in the northeast corner of the country, and the Kharkiv and Sumy are daily attacks and essentially constant contact between the enemy. So then you go further down to the southeast corner where you get to towards Donetsk. And there, again, is a big, fight going on towards, trying to grab control towards Kramatorsk and Slovyansk in that area. In the very south, there are daily drone attacks on civilians and throughout Kherson, the city. There are missile attacks on Odessa, etc. Also on the various towns there. But as far as push through with artillery and that type of fight, it's mostly in those few areas in the east. Every area is probably hot in some way. Now, through the rest of the country, this is usually what makes the news, is that Russia keeps launching combined drone and missile attacks. And the drones have gone from just 12 in the first year of 2022 to 20 and 30, which would be news. Oh my God, they went up to 35, to now. Earlier this year it was well over 100 per night, and that was making news. And now it's above 730 something. I think was the highest one a few nights back that it was mentioned. The random missile firings across the country that keep people at subdued are not located only at Kyiv. So the capital with its pretty good air defense setup, I would say, is something that Russia has just they pick and poke when they want to hit towards the capital. But one thing that really burdens Ukrainians is that all the other areas that get hit feel just as personal. So when they hit Kremenchuk or they hit Lviv or they hit any of these other cities, especially like there was an American factory hit the other day way out in Zakarpattia, which is very far to the west. It's in the mountains. It's kind of where people go to relax and get away. Ski stations up there, and there's a appliance factory out there, Flextronics, I think is what it's called, and that burned for almost 2.5 days of all the material there being attacked. And it's an American enterprise, and Ukrainians are like, that's not enough now. I mean, when will there finally be action towards stopping this? So that's what they're doing now. As far as the city itself, we've kind of, God bless, we've had it mostly quiet since the last significant strike on July 31st, which took out a big section of apartment building, killing 31 people. As you may know, I go to many of those and write about them. I get to know a lot of people from those. I don't necessarily write about everybody, though. I very rarely write the stories I hear. I will abstract them. I write them in my journals for when I need them at a later time, but I'm real protected with their life because they're not always wanting to talk to the world. They'll talk to me. They want me to talk to you, but they don't necessarily want to go with all the trauma they're going on to just run up and have a camera thrown in their face or something like that. And I don't do that. I build rapport with people. So
yeah, I noticed that with all of the stuff that you write, you first of all you protect the people that you're interviewing. A lot of times you can see that.
Consider them first and foremost.
Yeah, very very considerate. Now, when the war in Ukraine isn't like what Israel is doing to Gaza. In other words, Israel is all but carpet bombing Gaza and just blowing up everything because they have the power to do it. Ukraine is a much larger country. Well, it's a huge country with a lot of actual stuff. And when we look at Kyiv or Lviv or any of these other places, are there major destruction in these places, or is it just the outlying areas that you spoke about before?
Well, I don't really think there's good parallels between Israel and Gaza and Ukraine and Russia. It's just there's such different everythings, really, and even down to just minutia. And I've studied the other one fairly well, but. One thing that I think is really important to understand about, we got the sun blaring in here on me, so that's kind of interesting. Sunset's hitting. Marco Rubio, a few months ago when he got his new position, just talked about how terrible it was in Ukraine. And he had this futility tone to him. And it was very depressing to hear him say that because I'm like, why don't you come here before you talk like that? Because actually why we're so desperate to get attention to protect is because there's plenty here to protect. There are plenty of people here alive, plenty of things that are great. The schoolyards are perfectly good.
Factories.
Places have been rebuilt. Why wouldn't you at least protect it? Like it's like say, well, And so what those of us who talk about this too much assess is that it's a resignation tone. People don't want to throw money at something that's already destroyed. They want to help with something that's worth helping and that it's not too far gone to stop. So Ukraine is not too far gone to stop. You can stop Russia right now, and Ukraine will be a very healthy country in a few more years with what I've seen from Ukrainians, just Ukrainians without the outside support. I have no doubt Ukrainians can do everything they need for this country if Russia would stop bombing, period. If Russia would stop all aggression right now. Number two is that Ukraine is far more in line with the values I know all of the people I've ever worked with in my life believe in. Normal people have a job. They want to go work. They want to pay for their rent, or if they try to own a little home, they want to do that. They don't have big, advanced, super greedy ambitions. The few that might are no different than our society. The few might. And they like us. I'm an American. I get treated really, really well here, even when America is constantly flipping around under Donald Trump. I still get treated very well. They have an ideal about America that is, I believe, unreal. It's unrealistic. I'm the cynic. I'm the son that left America and said, "Did you have any mass shootings in your grocery store today?" No. Okay.
No. Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
I had someone ask if I would take them to America, and I go, "You don't want to move back to America?" I said, "Okay, let me ask a question. We have missiles, yeah. We have drones, yeah. Did a kid walk into a grocery store today and shoot everyone up? No. Oh my God. Exactly."
I mean, that is an interesting perspective as something that a whole lot of folks are, in fact, a whole lot of foreign governments are now telling their people it's a risk coming. Who would think we'd live to right? Who would think we'd live to the day that that America, the other countries are telling America is a clear and present danger if they go to America? I'm going to have a question for you in a minute when you get back to closing your windows. That's all right.
Too blinding.
I got it. Hey, Justin has a question. He says, one of the first questions I had when I started to dig deeper is, why did I know so little about Ukraine? Why wasn't I taught about thousands of years of history in the region? Maybe Chris can talk about global Russian effort to suppress Ukrainian history. I think we kind of spoke a little bit about that earlier, but you want to expand on that some?
Let me talk about one that's interesting. I did a project at the beginning of the year with a friend about cultural product. What does a country do to explain to the rest of the world about itself? And what does Ukraine do, and what does Russia do? And Russia puts out, its ballet and its athletes and its, great Russian soul and its literature and theater and all that. Okay, great. Well, Ukraine has all those things. The difference is, if you really dig into a lot of great Russian things, they're actually not Russian. They're stolen from others. They're repurposed from others. The part of an identity that was something else more than under the Russian Empire, for instance. And remember, that's the trick about empires, is that there's little areas underneath their identities, right? So much like Stalin was a Georgian. And inside there, you get a lot of areas that are presented as Russian when in fact they're not. Or you don't get to hear, like when I was in school, you don't get to hear about the authors that were Ukrainian, the musicians that were Ukrainian, composers that were Ukrainian, like Senko. But I'll give you an example of where I first realized maybe where that worked on our side. So I had a book with the Encyclopedia Britannica series called The Great Books of the Western World. I don't know if you heard of that one. And I used to know the guy who compiled it. But he compiled it from like Iliad and the Odyssey all the way to Freud. And inside there are Dostoevsky and Tolstoy as great literature. But what's missing is anything from Ivan Franko, anything from, Alessia Ukrainka, anything from like historians like Hrushevsky, who were writing about things here, but you didn't get to hear about any of that. And it's just a mere coincidence. Mortimer Alder was the one who compiled that. I knew it'd come to me. Mortimer Alder compiled all this. Well, this was in the 50s, 1954. It just happens to be that Stalin was also promoting that they had these great literary works called Dostoevsky and Tolstoy that talked about the great Russian soul. Okay. So he didn't give a shit about telling about Ukrainian stuff, even though they controlled through what is known as the Ukrainian SSR. They did control area, but you didn't get to hear any of that because they didn't want any of that part out. You had to hear about the Russian side. And this is part of why I'm 55, we in a certain area, we were allowed to hear Russian as a second language in school up until a certain point. Houston, I don't know when that ended, sometime in the 80s. But we didn't get exposed to authors in a whole region, not just Ukraine, a whole bunch of regions. There are authors that are key to understanding human life, that the empire is what will decide ultimately, whether it's an English empire, a Portuguese empire, a Russian empire, or an American empire. The other ones will not be seen.
That is sad. Yeah, and that is something for us to see. I mean, to talk about even here in the United States, because that is the argument that we have right now, even under the Trump administration, the idea of erasing culture, and not only erasing culture, but lying and creating a culture that never was.
Lying and creating a culture that never was. The mythological Russian soul. I'm a cynic at this point, and people have to forgive me on that. But I do realize that if you take the actual history of Russians and you take the written history as it was distilled even from people in I'll say the 1980s history book. I don't want to go to modern times because I don't know what those look like. But when I was in school, it bought into this idea about Russians that totally we didn't see Ukrainians at all. We just didn't see them. They didn't exist.
Right.
If you did see a Cossack, you didn't see what that meant. You didn't get any kind of historical development. You didn't hear, for instance, here's an important one to Justin's question. Why didn't we hear that this area had democracy a long time ago under the Cossacks? Like they basically handled their governance under democracy. And that's lost. So that's why it's sad that these nuances are lost. I love living here for the fact that I'm a history junkie, first off. That was my one subject I did just naturally well in. Here, it's a very painful history. It's the road in which so many things met. In fact, I just literally live at the juncture because I live on what's called left bank Kyiv. So I'm basically on the east side of the country. In fact, there are people in Kyiv that go, that's not Kyiv, that's left bank. But when I had a battle here, air defense going off, missiles supersized everything. It was a massive battle about 2 months ago, all night long. I had a very big metaphoric view for the first time in this in a way that I hadn't had. I mean, it was like 921. Like I'm flashing back how many years war, the Golden Horde. This is where battles keep coming. This is it. Battle of Good and Evil right here over the top of my head. It is the same time. Oh my, and it was a lot of it coming in because of the, like behind me, I don't have my camera around, but I have history books of this whole region. And it's there again, for real, not a theoretical situation. People
You're
get
actually
killed
seeing it in real time, and you've actually seen it
from my eyes, brother.
You've seen the dead bodies as you've gone to those apartments that have been blown up, etc. And it does something.
I'll go one layer deeper. I'll go one layer deeper on purpose because it is required. I had a person who called from America about a petty issue amongst people. I don't really care what it was, and it was important to them. And I said, "You have to understand where I'm at." Oh, I understand. I mean, I see the photos and and the work you're doing. Okay. And I saw the apartment that was blown in half, and she was talking about in Dnipro from January 14th, 2023 attack. And I knew what she meant. And then I said, okay, yeah. And I said, did you hear the woman crying from one of those collapsed floors begging for the rescue workers to help her? No. And then she went back to trying to relate, which I totally respect. I do understand. But she didn't understand where I was at. Was that as a person, a photographer, or doing video, writing, whatever you're doing, when you're in that, there are complex emotional things happening to every human being in front of you. And to hear a person first wailing for their life and then losing that energy where they're barely whimpering and then you don't hear anything. And if you're impressed, it's like you'll be there through some of that and you'll be corralled around for safety reasons and other reasons. But you go through all that. We can have all day there. We'd be there all day meeting people. And then we see the coverage of it, and it's very two-dimensional. One person killed, 2 people killed, 3 people killed, 14, like numbers, right? What's their names? What did the world do different after 31 people were killed on July 31st that they didn't do when it was this building, that building, this building, that building, this building, that building, this building, that building, this building, that building. And that's if I just only deal with my city. Just in Kyiv, I know too many locations that are on my little personal map that I go to film that have been destroyed. And that's just in my city. That's not before I go to the places that I've been outside of the city. Like for your viewers who might not know, I know some of my friends are watching right now, so they'll know this. But I filmed in Bucha the first week after the Russians were thrown out. I filmed the dead Russian soldiers in their BMPs along the road to Kyiv. I filmed the mass graves in Izum in September 2022. I've interviewed people in recently released occupation area of Kherson. And in each one of these, there are so many complexities that will never make it in the news. They just don't make it in the news. They can't. I don't know how we could because there's so many. I need the feedback from the viewers, for instance. So when they tell me how they heard it, I go, okay, so you didn't catch this part. Okay, so the next time we do the story, we have to remember to get that out of the story, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
It is sad. Now, where Donald Trump currently is quote unquote negotiating with Vladimir Putin. Zelensky.
What could go wrong?
No, but here's the funny part. I shouldn't say funny. Zelensky is pretty much treated as a lapdog to these guys, as if, these are the masters deciding what Zelensky is going to do. How do the people in Ukraine that you've been in contact with feel the United States? How do they feel about how the United States is conducting this negotiation? And do they feel they're getting the respective deserved?
No. The kind of goodwill pact that existed between average Ukrainians and the government of America. And I will say that I do hear that people very often know that it's not about the people necessarily. They hear that they'll see through press reports that the poll numbers show 60+% to 70% support in America, and that helps. But it's the things that Trump can't stop saying that are lies that hurt the most.
Give me an example.
Ukraine started the war. The idea that territory swapping should happen. These things that just seem not the way they would see how they would treat someone in the same situation if Ukraine wasn't the one in the situation and the Ukraine was giving the aid. What would they do? And they wouldn't do this at all to anybody. That's what.
And you can imagine how, I ask many Americans.
And they're very graceful people too. Let me add, they're extremely graceful. So I don't hear like what I think of as utter outrage. So the slightest murmur of outrage speaks volumes because of how reserved and calm and polite people are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
It's not we emote like Americans we emote,
Right. I don't think anybody's as loud as we are as far as when we're emoting things.
Might go, Egberto, I'm a wee bit disappointed.
Right.
And for some people, like, did he say that? Like, my career is over. Like, you know what I mean? Like, some people, that's like, that man, he was so harsh today. No, Ukrainians are like that. There's a side that's remarkably subdued while revealing a deep wound. And I think it's important because when you watch them on television, not just Zelensky, but anyone else who's speaking for Ukraine, there's a certain graciousness that goes up first. So that's confused as okay with, as opposed to being respectful. So people don't catch that the answer that's coming out, like through an interview on CNN with someone who's Ukrainian besides Zelensky, I watch how it gets percolated back into the American audience, especially different pockets that talk about Ukraine, and different people hear different things from the same voice. And I know what the Ukrainian is actually saying. And the Ukrainian is not saying it's perfectly okay if we give up territory. The Ukrainian is not saying it's okay. We so want to stop dying that we're willing to just roll over and give up our children's future. No one's saying that.
It's not rocket science, though. What will it say if Russia invades and Ukraine has to cede land in order for the war to stop? Right. And again, that is the reason we fought World War II. That's the reason we fought. I mean, isn't that the reason, when Hitler was going from territory to territory, et cetera, to stop that doesn't happen anymore, but somehow it is. Trump wants, not anybody else. He wants there to be a negotiated settlement for land after an invading force comes in. That is anathema to everything we used to believe.
So, yeah, you mentioned the 1939 Munich Sudetenland.
Oh, yeah, that is with Chamberlain, right?
Yeah, so I'm Czech by blood. I'm Scottish, English, Irish, and Czech. And, that we'll give him a little bit of land and he'll be satisfied. He'll stop. We've done that. We've seen that. And the Tibetans saw it to no response. Let's mention our Tibetan friends for the same reason. Tibetan identity's been all but wiped out. No one's heard of Tibetan protest. There's not been a Tibetan protest at the White House in forever. I have Tibetan friends who talk to me about Ukraine. And they talk about the fact that at least, God bless, people are outraged in some capacity about what happens in Ukraine. No one stirs a finger about my country, Tibet. And I'm like, yeah. And it's just so true. It's ridiculously true. But what does that say about our world? Because people who think it's okay that, well, that's not my war, like, I don't know what these ICE raids are all about, but from what I understand, philosophically, we have people in America who don't think that the borders are a small issue. We see they're a little intent that invading forces bother them, especially invading forces that may murder and rape somebody. I seem to get this metaphor down, even though in America it's incorrect. Here it's for real. Russian invaders murder, rape Ukrainians, period. I've interviewed people who've been through this hell. And so it's pretty easy to say, if you're willing to turn a blind eye to what happens to Ukrainians, what are you? Your society is over. And
actually, the truth of the matter is that is a fight that we have even here in the United States. You just brought up the topic of ICE. And how many people that are turning a blind eye to what ICE is doing. And unless we correct that rather quickly, where we're heading to is no different than any, everybody use that authoritarian. It's almost cliche now, what they don't understand is that you lose your dignity, you lose your hope, you lose your existence. And just like your Tibetan friend said, nobody's even talking about it anymore. And when you reach to that point, it's over.
A month ago, I was in Mykolaiv to do a report, and democracy broke out again here in Kyiv. The government had passed a bill that pissed off the people about independence of two organizations that were created in 2014 in answer to Yanukovych and to concerns about corruption. So now, and I think that the beauty of what happens, in fact, even here, I have a guy I really like, he runs the cafe, who said one time, but isn't Zelensky a dictator? He thought Trump was a businessman. And I go, Dima, when you try to get this policy fixed in the Rada, the parliament here, doesn't it happen? Doesn't it doesn't it get stagnant because of what I call policy paralysis? Like everyone's got to have this part and this part. He goes, yeah. That's the exact opposite of dictatorship, brother. Like dictatorship's neat. And exactly. I use this phrase very clearly. Autocracy is very neat. It's why some people actually like autocracy, because the rules are very neat. I didn't say it's nice. It's not. It's brutal. But it's neat. And I say that with cynicism on a particular level. Now, when it's neat, as opposed to, and I'll tell you, in the end of this, I'll tell you where I got that realization. It involves these two leaders. It's easy to report about, right? It's easy to understand. It's on and off. And I had this realization when I watched Zelensky's press conference and Putin's press conference in December 2023, because Zelensky was asked questions by some Ukrainian press about, how money was being spent in the country to do this project or that. And he just kind of like, okay, can we move on from that question? Because the one reporter, I know who she is, she likes to kind of get under his skin a little bit. And it's fun. It's back and forth. And the whole thing had this kind of like a real press conference, which if you go back a few days to the Putin press conference, no one could do that. No one asked a question. If a question goes, oh, dear leader, yes, how great are we doing? Oh, we're doing really, really well. Oh, thank you so much. That's what it was. It was neat. And I had just finished write-up about his whole 4-hour-long press conference. And then I go to the other one. I'm like, man, that was just kind of murky. But my brain went, but democracy's murky.
Yes.
It's murky. It's difficult. Everyone has an opinion. So what did we see a month ago? And I told everyone at dinner that night in Mykolaiv, a bunch of Ukrainian journalists, I said, hold up. I have faith. I have faith in you. And sure enough, boom, like on my newsfeed, almost within 15 minutes was Zelensky calls the head of NABU, head of SAPU, head of SBU, head of prosecutor's office. I forget who the fifth category was. We're going to have a meeting tomorrow. We're going to figure all this out. We're going to listen to everybody. We're going to get it right. And the protests went on. But people were just like, hey, we're not taking this shit anymore. We've already been through this Yanukovych. We put the foot down. We're not doing it. And it took 1 week for that to be rolled back. I have people say it's not fully rolled back. There are other issues, but it will still be
democracy.
Dealt with. But it was dealt with.
It was
in
democracy.
1 freaking week, a conformity to what the people demanded was much more in tune. And why? Because at the very top, no matter what problems happen here, they don't forget what happened with Yanukovych. Yanukovych wasn't a coup. Yanukovych was the people saying, you sold us out to who? We made a deal with the other folks. Yeah. No, we didn't ask you to make a deal with the people we left. We want to go have market deals with Europe, not Russia. And when he did that, they went out in the street and fairly protested, just like we used to do in America. And he didn't like that. So he sent people out to beat them up. They stood their ground. They didn't get violent. They didn't Jan 6. I'm an expert in Jan 6, by the way. They didn't Jan 6 on anything. They stood their ground. It was Yanukovych who delivered the deadly blows in February 2014, when he killed over 100 activists who were standing their ground against what was happening.
And look at what they found after he was overthrown. Yeah.
It had nothing to do with Victoria Nuland. It had to do with a person being a thug towards the people who knew what they wanted.
But that is the story that's being promoted here in the United States. Nuland did something, and that's why that gave Russia the opportunity to take Crimea, the opportunity to take Donbass or all these other things. And they're talking about dictatorship. You talk about it being
real quick on that. So to all your viewers, anyone who wants to come debate that, that's part of why I told you I'd take calls, because see, I've lived here. And so I've been able to talk to people for 3 years about their experience of 2014. And I've heard a whole range of stories from across the country. including people who were not here in Kyiv, who did things. And so I can tell how false that is just because the abundance of energy of people who don't really agree in the world, but they agreed on one thing. They had one area they agreed that in 2014, Yanukovych had to go. That Yanukovych sold him out to Russia. They no longer represented people. It was like he had his batch of people he only cared about. He was an autocrat. He had 4 years to treat them right, and he dealt violence on the people when they rose up to say, hey, we don't want that. And that's a lesson that what's interesting for what I really wish Americans would understand about that who don't is that think about if suddenly I hate these terms extreme right and extreme left because they don't make sense very well. Like Bernie Sanders is not the extreme left. Sorry. Like I used to read like Z magazine, like with Mike Parenti and those guys. So I know what the extreme left is. But from MAGA to the Bernie Bros, whatever, all those areas here in 2014, all those people were together to say, fuck you, Yanukovych. Okay. And if people don't get that plurality was there because you can't tell from Winter on Fire that's mostly one side. You can't tell from the fact that you had extreme ultras out there in the street. You can't tell until you talk to common people who are in none of those categories and hear what they wanted. And that's what I did for 3 years, was in the middle of like, hey, how did you get here? Well, I'm from Texas, and I tell my story. And then, what about you? Well, I'm from here, and they'll tell me their story. And that's how I learned what this country has been doing, was listening to these basic human life stories from people who have normal jobs. I'm the most interesting guy in the room to their mind because I'm the foreigner who speaks languages and does camera. I just have a basic job, Chris. I'm an accountant, or I do this, but they're not to me because they're the one who told me the story of this country. They tell me about their lives that are part of what makes any society really, really work. Yeah. And that's what is missing in CNN, New York Times headlines.
And that is the reason we have independent media. Let me just say this, Chris. 2 more questions that I have before we close because we're coming up on the hour. And the first one goes as follows. Give me your view as an expat looking into what's happening in America, what's happening to America.
It's actually heartbreaking. My biggest concern is people have no idea what to do right now. I think that the people have gotten really addicted to talking heads making magic comments for them. I'll isolate down to specific sectors, people who like MSNBC, which I always use the same metaphors. Like Rachel to say the great thing that will put Trump in jail. Pacifica listeners want Amy Goodman to say the nice thing that makes the world better. Whatever the variation is. We're not actively taking control of our communities. There are people who do, but mostly we're not doing that, and we're letting other people do that. And, I'm from Texas. I'm kind of ticked off about this map thing because I know what it's all about. It's racist as hell. Same old game. And the Democratic Party was flat-footed again on trying to stop any of it, as always, because it has its own institutional problems that needs to really look at and ask if it's ready to take on raw, violent fascists, because it's not.
Now, sadly, I agree with you.
Is that my good news answer?
No. Let me just tell you. One of the reasons I got out of what I was doing, you're a historian, you're a musician, I'm an engineer and a musician. So we have sort of different pathways to activism, what I call activist journalism, which I believe journalists have to be in these days. And one of the things that I know you left a lot of your other work for is your belief in making a difference. Same reason that I left what I was doing, because we understand that those talking heads that you talk about, I liked what you said, the magic comments that they make, completely uninformed magic comments. And as you watch that, you know a whole lot more history than I could possibly know. That's who you are. I'm a practical person in what I'm doing. We have to be here. Independent media has to be here because the other media, by definition, by how they operate, cannot and will not do the job because they're owned and paid for. They're good reporters working for them, trying their best.
That's true.
They're trying their best, but there are lines that they have to toe. Many of them have migrated to Substack. Unfortunately, many of those that have migrated to Substack still have the anchor of that, the muscle memory of the rules they had to follow when they worked for corporate media. That's one of the reasons I try to feature people like yourself, independent guys out there really getting the job done and really informing. I think it's a utmost necessity. And before I ask you the last question, I want to ask our audience to make sure to support folks like our brother here, Chris Sampson, who's really doing the work. In the blog that I wrote for him this morning, there are links to the new Substack that he has just started posting his material. We spoke about, this is one platform that his message can be gotten over unabashedly. In other words, not censored like some of it will be on YouTube, not censored like some of it would be on Facebook. We hope that this remains. And of course, go ahead and sign up to his Substack, become subscribers, followers, however you want to. But most importantly, for those who have the wherewithal to do so, support the work. I ask kindly, support his work, support my work. We are here aiming to bring an adulterated, I don't want to say truth, but things as it is, and things that you can actually know it's not coming from above, but coming from people just like you, just like Sampson, just like myself. So the last question, and I think you probably would have an answer. How can the Ukraine deal be handled, be closed?
Honestly, I feel like people need to listen to Ukrainians. I think that I'll give you an easy answer for that, I believe. I have close friends who have family divided into occupied territory. They are literally hostages under occupation. I think people need to think about World War II Nazi occupation and how we kind of immortalize a generation who believed in not letting that happen to people. Stop thinking of territory as square kilometers or square miles or any of that, or what minerals under it. It's the humans. Mostly it's also elders and certain people who really couldn't easily or for some reasons just get up and leave, and they wound up staying hoping maybe it would just kind of blow over, and it didn't. It's morally right, I believe strongly, to listen to your inner voice in your own consciousness. That what would it be like if your mom, your dad were the ones who were left there because you happen to be the one who got out in time, and you heard that the world just didn't really want to do anything about rescuing them from a brutal, illegal occupation. I think that's the biggest thing, is that we're not talking about like how we have in some wars where the conflict is resolved by aiming to hear the needs of certain parties in this. It's different when it's a pure raw invasion, where essentially it's all up to whether or not we can stop the pathogen from taking over. Because you can't blame the target of that violence, whether you want to use the word victim or not. So victim is certainly one term that'll work, but you can't keep going to the victim and say, okay, well, what part are you willing to give up with? We've already said you have to lose your purse. Now you got to lose, your left eye, and you've been raped. Will you just start to comply, please? Because that's what it sounds like with this current team of negotiators, is they just have no sense of what has just occurred in front of everybody. And I can say that way beyond Zelensky, because it's unfortunate, I know he would agree with me. I definitely know he would agree with me. It's not about Zelensky. It's about that he represents, and he did not quit on Ukrainian voices who need him to come up there and say, we still need your help. And it's because just like any human being listening to me now needs a fire department or needs, some other rescue system to come along and above normal circumstances, thank God it's there for you. When it's not there, you'll know the difference. And when it stops at the front door and says, oh, now, wait a minute. No, we'll put your house fire out in a minute. But first, no one thinks that's right. And that's what's been happening to Ukraine, especially in the last 3 years.
Well, before I close here, I want to thank Richard Hanna, also lovingly known as Rad at KPFT 1FM Houston, Rad Rich, who reconnected us, Brother Sampson. Both of us, all of us are there at KPFT 90.1 FM. And again, so Rad, I don't know if you're listening or not, but thank you so kindly for reconnecting us, our KP brother. We've been speaking to Chris Sampson. Chris Sampson is
journalism.
Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, please.
one moment for independent journalism. So independent journalism is very vital for the fact, like, I know who reports to me. I report with my camera. I know the distance between the attack in my camera and my message to you and my ability to answer your questions. That's a chain of custody of information. I did a terrorism job for 12 years. There are certain cases where I had firsthand contact to situations where my information was superior than the news services. This is something I'm addicted to, which is why I do what I do for a living. But it's what you need. You need to have that person, whether it's me or someone else, who's just obsessed with that information connection so that you get as close to that contact as possible. And one of the things I've done for the last 3 years is try to make sure when I film something that I'm there to answer the questions about what got filmed. When I'm preparing for the next round of stuff, I'm incorporating what I heard from people who ask questions. So CNN doesn't do that. New York Times, they don't do that. There is no back and forth interaction. I don't do it that way because I think that I'll fail you, both as the people who watch what we do and the people who need to hear that we need you to hear their stories. And so that's what independent media can do. And that's my spiel.
I think that is a perfect way to end it. Chris Sampson is a photojournalist and editor-in-chief of National Security Media based in Ukraine. The blog, I have a correspondent blog, and there will be a correspondent TikTok on this particular interview that I'll be posting shortly. Chris, I want to thank you very much for spending this hour with us. It has been invaluable. And I think a whole lot of folks who've been listening have learned a lot. We'll, of course, be discussing this subject more often. Likewise, we'll be discussing other subjects that you are well aware of, not only foreign, but national away. Thank you, national.
I know my Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, 3%ers. I know those things. I still don't forget my old job.
Trust me, you're a key brother. Thank you so kindly for being here. Folks, those of you who listened, I want to thank you all. Lady Historian says, please give my love to Ukrainians on their Independence Day. I'm sure Chris will. Thank you so kindly for spending this Saturday with us. You all have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day.
All of our country's problems, from polarization to ignorance on domestic and international issues to a complete misunderstanding of our economic and healthcare systems, are a direct result of a derelict mainstream media that too often bend over backwards to support corporate or bought politicians' wants as opposed to the people's needs for real information to make their lives better. Independent media is the only solution to inform truthfully and factually. Why? Because our loyalties are to you, the ones who fund us with small dollar contributions and subscriptions. Please consider supporting our independent media platforms by subscribing to our Egberto Off the Record newsletter at politicsdoneright.com/newsletter. Again, that is politicsdoneright.com/newsletter. It's an investment that pays incalculable dividends.